I was just sort of saying that the reason really why we're putting the session on, we sort of find that people often have a sense of what circles is, they know a little bit about it, and they're familiar with the terminology, but don't really sort of know what that looks like in practice if you've not been involved with that before. So the purpose of today is to hopefully give you a sense of, you know, what circles really does and what that looks like in practice, certainly from a probation perspective as well, how that helps with the work that we do. And so circles is something that we use for people with sexual convictions. It's a really unique model in the sense that it makes use of volunteers from the local community in terms of that reintegration of that individual. It's also different in the sense that it's overseen, its delivery within the UK is overseen by Circles UK, who are tasked really with setting the standards for high quality circles delivery in the UK. So it's quite a unique and specific model, and we hope to be able to sort of share some of the detail around that with you today. And I'm just really delighted to say that we've got a colleague from Circles UK with us. So Leah has joined us to do the lion's share, I think it's fair to say, of this morning's presentation. But hopefully that means you'll be able to get a real sense of what that looks like. And at the end, if you've got any questions, hopefully we'll be able to answer those for you. But I wanted to begin by just sort of saying, I guess, setting the context a little bit about why this is really important to the work that we do in probation. So as you're hearing from Leah about what Circles does and what it looks like, sort of understanding the relevance of that for the work that we do. So I mentioned that Circles is for people with sexual convictions, for people who have an existing sexual conviction who are at high risk of going on to commit a further sexual offence, but also where social isolation is a criminogenic need, and that's really important. So I'm just going to start with a couple of minutes just to sort of give the context of why that is important. So I hope that this will work. Can somebody, Emma, I can see Emma's thumb on the other screen. Brilliant. Okay. So when we are thinking about why social isolation is important in our sort of response to sexual offending, we can sort of look to the world of academia and the evidence around the fact that sort of the causes of crime can be considered in relation to that sort of complex interplay between social, psychological and biological factors. So things that you will have heard about probably more commonly, such as the biopsychosocial theory. And it's that social dimension of the biopsychosocial theory that is particularly relevant for the work that Circles do. So when we sort of start to look at that in relation to sexual offending, we know that there are particular features in sexual offending where that social dynamic is really important. So I've sort of mentioned a couple of studies here to set that into context, really. So a key study by Mann and colleagues back in 2010 found that within the overall sort of set of psychologically meaning risk factors for sexual offending, there were a number that were related to sort of that social dimension. So things such as having a lack of emotionally intimate relationships with adults, that role of sort of chronic employment instability, and also a really important one around negative social influences, so the peer group and the impact that can have on the individual. And I think as well, the other thing that is really important to think about, so not just those sort of features of what somebody's social world looks like, but also that sense of identity as well that they have, because identity is a really relational aspect between the individual and the society they're operating in. And Wakelin and colleagues found that for people who remain in that place of living as a sexual offender, this can really create sort of barriers and difficulties with their social reintegration, sort of perpetuating that sense of ongoing isolation and just remaining disengaged from the world around them. So that's really important. But there are other studies that point to the fact that where we can start to improve some of those social connections, that can have an impact with people to whom it's relevant, not everybody with a sexual conviction, but those who it's relevant, it can have an impact on their sort of future and that sort of desistance journey. So certainly, as I've put there, that first study around how that helps, how the society around them can help that individual in moving from that identity of being a sex offender to having that non-offending identity through sort of what Sampson and Laub talk about, informal social controls. So where we often use with people with sexual convictions, very formal social controls, such as, you know, restrictions as part of somebody's sentence and notification requirements. Also the importance of the informal stuff, so things like work and those personal relationships and how that can help somebody moving away from crime. But I wanted to sort of finish on this bottom one and this study by Braithwaite about sort of reintegrative and disintegrative shaming, because I think this is really important from us from a probation perspective, I think. So within probation, we absolutely have a duty and are committed to making sure that we pay attention to people's pasts and their histories, what they've done before, and really recognising the potential they might have to cause harm again. And I think we have to, you know, that is our core work, and we have to be recognising that we can't look at people's futures without recognising their potential for harm. But I think what Braithwaite talks about is really important, because he sort of talks about the importance actually of that community disapproval within that process. So not forgetting what they've done, but actually that sort of sense of community response to the individual for what they've done. So often in the sense of, you know, a sanction, going to prison, or a community sentence. But then how beyond that, the importance of that individual being accepted back into the community. The flip side of that being where some people remain in that place where the community demonstrate that disapproval and censure for the offending, but that person then remains in that ostracised place, and how that can really hinder somebody's desistance journey. So I just wanted to sort of share that before we move on. So hopefully you've got that in the back of your mind when we start to hear about the role that circles can play then, particularly with that group I talked about in hopefully their desistance journey. So without further ado, I'm now going to hand over to you, Leah, I think. And yeah, over to you.
Thank you. I'm just going to bring up some PowerPoints. And just check, can people see those?
Not yet. We'll hopefully it's
yeah, it might be that it's not liking this thing, and Emma, you may have to share them for me. Let me go back on Teams.
No problem. Let me just see if I can find them just in case, Leah.
Yeah. Could be. I'm clicking share and show open. I know it's the first two. Well, good morning, everyone. While you're sitting in the background, please excuse the technical bits. While we're waiting for them to come up, perhaps I introduce myself. My name is Leah Warwick and I work for Circles UK, and I have done for some years. But my background is probably very similar to many of yours in that I spent more than 20 years in various roles within the probation service, and then I was an operational manager in youth justice. And throughout my career, I've always had a focus in different things on working with people who cause sexual harm and those who experience the harm from them. I think we might have some bits here. And the purpose today really is just to thank you for your interest in Circles, and to say I could talk ad nauseum about this approach. We could spend several days together, and what I've attempted to do is condense just some of the key points and hopefully answer some of the questions that other criminal justice professionals have asked me over the years about Circles, and then present you with some evidence and some film which we think will add a little bit of meat to the bones and probably say more than any research paper could. Now I can see them, but I don't know if I can. Let's have a look. Slideshow. Emma, can you press slideshow and then from the beginning? Thank you. And if we could go on to the first one, the next slide. Thank you. As I said, over the years, people have asked me all sorts of questions in various contexts, and this is an attempt on my part to summarise the key ones that come up. So I'm going to ask Emma to click and they'll emerge in time when I speak. First one is always, well, how does this work then? This seems like quite a strange idea to fit alongside the statutory work of trained professionals. So tell me about how they work. Next one. The other common question is, so this sounds like a good idea, I can see the purpose of it, but what is the public protection benefit here? Because this is our principal focus. And added to that is, well, tell me, I'm engaged in risk management, how will this support me to do it? This is a key one. Again, show me the evidence that these things work and are not just something purposeful to do. And then around, okay, what are the sort of organisations that deliver these circles? Are they organisations that I have a kindred and a shared sort of ethics and philosophy? Are they organisations whose output I can trust? This is an intriguing one, which comes back, and I remember was one of my first questions when I engaged with circles, was why use volunteers? What is the critical extra that they bring along when so much input goes into training us as professionals to do this very purposeful and necessary work to keep our communities safe? And then how am I going to know it's good enough? How am I going to know that what I'm getting when I make a referral is something that's safe and consistent and the practice standards are things that I can respect? And then in using volunteers, what guarantees do I have that these are people who are going to receive the right sort of training and supervision for me to be confident that the work they're doing is safe and overseen? And then the professional staff that oversee this work, given many of them work in charities, how can I be guaranteed that they have the sort of experience and qualifications I know they ought to have to work with high risk people convicted of sexual offences? And finally, if I take the leap and I refer someone for this work, how will I know what's going on? How will I be kept informed? Because I'm the individual who probably be holding this case and have to retain statutory responsibility for it. So those are the sorts of questions. And in the next slide, it's just a condensed attempt to sort of cover some of the key areas about the why, what and how of circles, and then to show you some other evidence that will hopefully, you know, illuminate that a little bit more. So Emma, if you could just keep pressing the tabs again. This bit relates to the fact that Helen introduced earlier as these things come up. The research, the widening body of evidence and research that demonstrates isolation and alienation are known high risk factors for sexual recidivism, that alienated individuals separated from communities present a greater risk. And Circles in a nutshell are a unique programme for reducing those sorts of risks. And the goal of this whole approach, this whole intervention, is to work to prevent victimisation. So the focus is on those who have caused harm to prevent them causing harm. And you'll see in lots of the literature, if you've seen it, that the mission statement is no more victims. Now, essentially, this is a community initiative. It's about very much often that transition of individuals who've often served lengthy custodial sentences, and they have that crossover event of transitioning back and trying to find a space within communities, but it's using other members of those communities to be the support and accountability mechanisms around them. And on that basis, they exist to augment public protection arrangements. This doesn't exist in isolation or separate from the work that many of you will do. It works in harmony. It works there to bring added value to your focus. And essentially what you will receive is a circle in which 4 to 6 local people, carefully screened, rigorously trained, closely supervised, work with someone on your caseload who's been assessed for high risk, and they do it for 12 months. This is not a short-term programme of intervention. This is about the long haul, where relationships are built over time and trust becomes a key issue around monitoring what people are doing and assisting them to make better choices. And they have 2 goals. They're going to support that person to safely reintegrate, and they're going to hold them accountable. So the volunteers in that group will be appraised of the risks that that individual presents and the triggers that might be important for them to know. And they will be open, honest and transparent in exploring that with those individuals, not in a therapeutic way, but in an attempt to kind of assist them to better self-manage and to focus on activities that are going to be more protective moving forward. Now, no one can be compelled to participate in a circle. The individuals you refer must agree to do so, and it's not a condition of parole. The reason behind that is the ethos and a huge body of evidence that demonstrates that that voluntary social contract is a key part of the success. This has to be something people are ready for and willing to commit to, because it's long haul. But essentially, the fact that the people they are meeting with are there so because they want to be, plays a role in affecting change. These are sometimes the only individuals who are not professionals, part of their network of, oversight that they have contact with. And there's something about people giving of their time consistently and regularly that's a powerful dynamic here. And here, just to comment a little upon your colleagues in circles who are the professional staff that oversee and deliver these things. Now, staff employed to deliver and coordinate circles are individuals you will recognise. The majority have a background as probation officers, public protection officers in the police and similar. But as a minimum, they have to have relevant experience, qualifications. The components must include experience and knowledge around understanding the characteristics, theories and causes of sexually harmful behaviour. They must be skilled risk managers. They must understand treatment approaches, and importantly, they must have all the sufficient safeguarding experience and qualifications. And on top of that, they must undergo circle specific training, which is delivered by the umbrella organisation I work for, and they have to commit to a programme of ongoing professional development, which is centred around their circles work. So that in a nutshell is what circles are and how I hope they will relate and answer some of the questions you may have brought. I'm now going to pass you back to Emma, who's going to show you a short excerpt from a documentary that was put together by Sky News on circles in conjunction with us, which I think will tell you a little bit more about the functions and how it works in practice.
Bill, you had a pad. Have you got a pad?
In an undisclosed location in the southwest.
How are we all?
A circle is setting up for the night.
Surviving.
A group of volunteers who meet weekly with a sex offender.
Just half a cup of tea for me.
They've been working with for over 6 months.
Hey, come in.
We can't film him, have changed his name and used an actor to disguise his voice.
Hey, Sam. Nice to see you. So, as it stands at the moment, in theory, you can't be in a room with
a lone female, no. Because my crimes were against females and I understand that entirely. And it makes sense, which is why...
Well, I mean, we stick to that as well, don't we, in Circle?
Yeah,
so.
It's a bit like children. Okay, one of my crimes was against children, we know this. Yeah, my first crime, right? I cannot, my licence states I cannot, unless it's in the course of everyday lawful life, i.e. walking down the street and a kid runs up to me and says, I've lost my mummy and daddy, in which case it would be, get the phone out, phone the police and get the policeman there as soon as humanly bloody possible, right? It's the same with females as well.
Sam served over 12 years in prison. The objective here is reintegration back into society.
You know, there's very few of us who really can thrive without some kind of social contact. And so my view about where we go now in the next part of the circle is about really challenging you to look at those areas that you've got of interest.
I think that you feel that you don't deserve that because of your offences.
Sort of.
So you try and remain super closed off to that.
What are your worries about joining social groups?
Numerous. Scared of rejection, scared of allowing myself to open up to the wrong person, scared of other people's judgments, scared of an awful lot of stuff. Scared of myself as well, because I am still dangerous and I have to manage myself.
So he's your core member in the middle. On the outside, you've got your volunteers.
It works as a circle within a circle. Police and probation on the outside.
If you guys pass on risk information to us, which obviously you need to do, we would then pass it on immediately to police.
Volunteers on the inside, with over 600 active across England and Wales.
We get a lot of university students wanting to better their career, gauge where they want to go in the future as well, and a lot of people who just want to do good.
Their journey starts here.
So sex offenders need, victims need.
2 days of intensive training where we meet two very different volunteers.
I heard about circles when I was at university studying criminology.
I don't come from an academic background, it wasn't for that. I just wanted to do something that would help others.
I want to do it, but at the same time, how am I going to overcome the challenges if I hear something that is unsettling?
I know that they're most undesirable, and what they've done is a very serious criminal act.
You don't know how much you can deal with until you deal with it.
Often they don't have anyone to talk to about their offending or their current sexual thoughts.
The training covers everything from safeguarding
As that relationship develops, it's really important to remain risk aware.
to how to talk about sexual matters with a sex offender or core member, as they're called.
What sort of things might he have said and done that made you think, oh, actually he might be struggling with some sexual thoughts?
Just maybe like keywords or lack of it, and just behaviour, okay, like you did the mumbles, like, oh, I don't want to talk about it.
What makes a good volunteer, would you say?
It's very powerful to have somebody involved who's actually just giving up their time because they believe in their capacity to change. Doing this work, it's not about making justifications or excuses for people or minimising what they've done or minimising the harm. It's about preventing reoffending in the future.
Sam, just, well, you said a minute ago that you are still dangerous, or you are dangerous. What do you mean by that?
I've committed offences, yeah? I've allowed things to happen, which means that basically, well, I've got to manage myself to make sure that I don't go down the same paths again. I do not want to commit another offence.
What you've learnt to do since the offences is talk to people.
Yeah, I'm not disagreeing with that, and yes, I would scream for help if any of my triggers came up, but I also want to manage myself to make sure those triggers don't come off. I've done an awful lot of damage to people. This is hard. You know, right, I don't deserve it. Never have done.
So you don't want to get too happy because you feel like that's a disservice?
At the end of the day, after what I've done, I don't deserve it. I'm going to rot in hell for what I've done.
To follow their journey, volunteers are keeping video diaries.
Hi and welcome to my video diary. This is my first one. My family now know. Obviously they
did share some concerns. So like, why do I have to do it? Whether I can handle sitting across and listening to a registered sex offender. Well, I am concerned about it. I don't know if I can do it. I've never done it before.
I seem to be defending myself on why I'm doing this voluntary work, because every time I say sexual offenders, I get, you know, the bemused, stunned look, or why that group? They should be locked up. They don't deserve it. What about the victims? And you know, all valid points.
The timescale's critical because we've got a lot of core members that are assessed and waiting for a circle.
Daisy's a Circles coordinator in London with a probation background.
Hi Andy, are you well?
I'm fine, thank you.
Good to see you.
She helps recruit and assess potential volunteers.
Are there any types of core members or offence types that you wouldn't feel comfortable working with? Because sometimes, not everyone has any, but sometimes someone might.
I'm going to give you this. I don't know anything about it, so I can't tell you that.
Okay.
If you're ignorant of something, you won't know what you wouldn't and would know. But at the moment, I have no issue.
This particular core member has committed offences against adult women, so not against children, this one. So we need to make sure that there's a man in the circle, but actually there's going to be two.
I was surprised at what you said as well, that most of the offence were for children.
Maybe the majority would have committed offences against children, but in they're the most probably socially excluded because they're the bottom of the
I get it.
bottom of the bottom, aren't they, in terms of society's views? So yeah, that's probably why we have slightly more of them.
A small town in the BC interior.
Before being brought to the UK by the Quakers, Circles originated in Canada in 1994.
Is this a community's worst nightmare? It doesn't have to be.
The first ever sex offender to take part was Charles Taylor, who'd committed over 20 crimes. He died in 2005 without ever reoffending.
Victims need support, they need someone to trust.
Circles UK set up in 2008 and it's grown. In 2016-17, 163 circles were completed successfully. Just 3 were discontinued due to sexual reoffending. That's 5%. In 2017-18, 180 circles were completed, with 9 discontinued, 17%. And for the first half of 2018-19, 87 circles were completed, 5 discontinued, or 4.5%. All new offences were less serious, with some rearrested as a result of volunteer information.
Circles very much target the high and very high risk people. In terms of people who commit sexual offences, the vast majority, about 90%, won't commit another sexual offence.
Professor Belinda Winder's been researching circles for the last couple of years. The key, she says, is to prevent isolation.
If reoffending is going to occur, reoffending occurs more quickly following leaving prison. So it starts to slow down the level of reoffending, even with a very high risk guy. So if you've stayed offence-free for 5 years, you're highly likely to stay offence-free, however high risk you were to start with. Actually, it's really important that we look at protecting people for that first year or so, which is why the circle comes in so handy as a stepping stone for people to try and get them to engage with society.
It was my first session. He wants to be there. The fact that he's there and he wants to make a difference and he wants to make himself a better person, okay? I think that itself deserves a modicum of, commendation for it. He doesn't have to be there. It's a voluntary thing for him as well.
We're starting to delve into a bit more of the life during and after the offence. We haven't spoken about the offence. It still feels too early for that, but we're making progress towards.
I had been a virgin, so a lot of control and power and decision making was taken from me.
Despite the charity sometimes struggling to recruit, some survivors of sexual abuse are putting themselves forward to volunteer.
I wasn't physically harmed, but it's a violent attack. That's going to stay with you.
Rachel was raped when she was in her late teens. She came across the charity a couple of years ago.
The focus is on very much on the perpetrator, on the offender, which, as a survivor, my initial instinct was to bulk from that and to turn away from that. But ultimately, circles are helping perpetrators to end abuse. That can't be wrong.
There'll probably be a lot of people out there who have probably may have been through what you've been through, who won't understand how you feel about this.
Absolutely. All I can say is that person is still a person, and I think everyone should have a chance to turn their life around and to redeem themselves.
Even if offences against children?
Yeah, there's still. And I have children, and I'm thinking of them when I say this. I'm not saying this lightly, but if you can help someone to stop that happening to more children, then absolutely. Why would you not do that? Why would you not try to help someone? If I'm supporting it and I was raped, well, what can someone who hasn't been raped? What can they say against that charity and the work that they do?
Thanks, Leah. I'll just get the next slides up for you. Welcome back, everyone. I hope that, gave you a greater insight into the sort of day-to-day challenges and the individuals that participate in circles. And the next slide I'm going to share with you now just kind of pictures how that works in practice. When we talk about a circle, and you'll hear them called circles of support and accountability, or circles are the phrase we tend to use most these days, we're actually talking about two circles, an inner and an outer circle, and both have to exist for this intervention to take place. Now, along the side of this diagram, you'll see these are the key individuals participating in this process. And the person with a conviction we call the core member of the inner circle. And that's the group you'll see there, that core member, the volunteers that have been specifically matched to him, her or they in terms of devising that circle, so that it's a very person-centred approach. They're the individuals who will work and meet with that individual for up to 12 months. If circle moves on, we've had circles that have run for 2 years where need has presented. But that only exists in the context of there being this outer circle. And that outer circle, as you see there, those are those individuals such as yourselves that are the professionals involved in that individual's life. So this is typically MAPA, it's probation officers, it's police, public protection, but it may also be other key partner agencies such as housing workers or sometimes substance misuse workers. And the first phase of a circle we call phase 1. And in that phase, which is the first 12 months, that inner circle there is going to meet regularly every week to begin with, every week. And it will be at a venue that's selected and risk assessed by the coordinator so that it's safe, but also one that ensures that the core member's confidentiality is protected as well, because very often, as you will know, these are individuals who present some risk but are also extremely vulnerable to harm themselves. At every meeting, that group of volunteers will produce notes which they will share with the coordinator, and the coordinator will fact check and sense check those notes every time to look, for example, for positively signs of progress that they can share with the outer circle, but perhaps concerns that need to be shared too. And any immediate risk concerns are communicated to that coordinator immediately, and it's he, she or they who then get in touch with the outer circle members if this is something that might perhaps suggest a recall or the risk of a further offence, then any information that's gleaned will be passed on. The core member in the middle of that circle is very much aware of that process. It is all open and transparent. And so in sharing, they very much know that information they give that might in some way feel for them to be, incriminating will be shared. And there are umpteen examples where individuals have chosen to come forward to their circle where they haven't done with the professionals they're involved with, and that information is passed on and early intervention work has taken place. The coordinator they're also going to attend the MAPA meetings to keep you updated. They will send monthly reports. If progress is, moving along steadily, you're going to get the information through that route. You're also going to be part of the preparation in putting that circle together and be appraised of it going forward. And at the end of the 12 months, when it's a planned disengagement, so contact may reduce, it'll go fortnightly, then perhaps monthly, because we're assisting this individual to self-manage, there will be a thorough end of circle report which will come to you too. So you've got that oversight and analysis of what's gone on. And what happens in the meetings? Well, you saw that on the film. They're not all like that. Over time, there might be sort of special approaches that are taken. Perhaps it's supporting an individual to go to an interview and volunteers will help them through the door. Occasionally they will be what we call social events, but they're largely around familiarising that individual with normal functioning in the community. This may be someone who hasn't sat in a coffee shop for a long time with a group of people and had a normal conversation, hasn't engaged in a purposeful activity that you all deem safe because they're very scared of making that a first attempt to do so. So that's kind of the nature of it there. There's the option of a second phase, phase 2, if needed, and that's a much more informal withdrawal where the core member keeps in contact with the volunteers, but on a need to or wants to basis, as it were. There are also examples of core members coming back many years later and saying, I'm troubled about my behaviour now, and this is the first port of call. And again, that information is passed back. So I hope that makes sense of things. I've got a few more other slides just to give you a sense about how this is structured. Question we get is, it can be a little bit confusing when we think of Circle providers and Circles UK. So I just want to say a little word about that. Circles UK, the organisation I work for, is responsible for overseeing the provision of circles throughout England and Wales, so like a Ministry of Justice jurisdiction. We're an independent charity, but with a membership organisation. And what we do is we own the brand to protect it from everybody else coming up and doing this work not to such high standards, and we set the national standards that circles have to be run by. But the circles you will see are delivered by a group of individual and independent and professionally managed provider organisations. Some are charities that focus exclusively on circles type work. Others are an adjunct of larger organisations like NAPACs, Barnardo's, the Safer Living Foundation, etc. And this is part and parcel of what they do. They have to be approved by us. They have to go through quite a strenuous membership process to make sure their ethos and their staff group have all that's necessary, and they have to be approved by the local mapper in the areas they're working. They also have to be very rigorously quality assured every 2 years, and it's a process I'd liken a little bit to a probation inspection, but probably a bit more smiley, having been on the receiving end of that, in that a huge amount of evidence is gathered in, and then there are multiple site visits where casework is looked at. Key actors are interviewed, including the sort of probation officers and others that are in the outer circle. So here's our purpose vision. We're working with perpetrators, delivered by highly trained and skilled volunteers. The coordinators are professionally trained. It's not just a support group, there has to be the accountability element, and it's not a one-to-one. This is in essence a group process for very good reasons around safety, security, but also having different viewpoints. The difference being there is a single service user in the middle of it, and that's the core member. Now, question, does it work? We've been gathering evidence for years, not straightforward, as you might imagine, but there's a very good recent evaluation conducted by Nottingham Trent University, and it was of 188 circles. It had a large sample size, it was independent, and it looked at protective factors, predominantly around a range of variables, and it identified statistically significant findings. And here's some of the headlines. 52% of the core members grew in confidence, self-esteem went up 45%, 32% were more positive, 56% were less isolated, and very often that's the key risk factor that's identified by professionals with the people we work with. 67% showed an improvement in well-being, lots of evidence about the association with that, and reducing recidivism. 100% of the M were in stable accommodation, excuse me, and 42% were in paid or voluntary employment. And these are, as you will know, a very hard group to get into those areas. And the bit at the bottom, just to explain, there was an 18% reduction in dynamic risk, and that's using a bespoke dynamic risk management tool that is utilised throughout the circle. It's since been shifted to something called the Strengths Development Review. Previously it was based around the SARM domains, but again independently tested and verified. And then talking a little bit, I thought you'd want to hear more from the people that have been involved. This is a lovely thing that emerged from this study actually, and this is just representative, I think, of some of the core members on the impact. And this individual actually asked us to use this when we're working with people who are considering engaging in Circle, because it can be a slow process. If you can't see it, I'll read a bit. And he says, it's a he. Firstly, don't panic. These are great listeners. My group have helped me through the transitional period after the probation course I attended. I understand you'll be nervous with new people, having to explain a very difficult area of your past life. I know that to start off with, I certainly was. Can only suggest you're completely open and honest. And he says his life is so much better for the experience and the opportunity to just talk openly. He says he's more confident in himself and he feels empowered to cope with more everyday, what he calls normal situations. And this is someone who'd had major anxiety issues, and that was a component of his behaviour. And he ends with the usual situation of gaining trust and general friendship has also helped with my self-esteem. Here are a few other statements, again emerged. One that was quite profound that someone said at the, and this was a consequence of the work, a meeting with a circle, his urges, as he put them, were very much more under his control. Others had reflected on trauma in their own background and seen the impact of that, and some of the work we do is very trauma informed. And others just sort of saying that they were, you know, felt very much respected and that their viewpoints were important and listened to. And that was a powerful driver in them looking at life very differently and envisaging a better life that didn't involve the sorts of behaviours that had led them to offend. A couple more things from different perspectives. Here's one from a probation practitioner. I'll let you read this, but pick out the bit I think that says he thought it was hugely positive and motivating for this individual, and it was effective around concerns about this guy's tendency to isolate himself, and it had assisted this probation officer in more effectively supervising this person. And we all know what their caseload may have looked like, so the input coming in and allowing them to do that in a more focused way was very welcomed. And finally, a little bit, I think on this bit here, we have on some volunteer quotes, but I think they may have gone. Now, Helen, it's come back to you. I think we're a little bit short of time. So I wonder if at this point there's any more you want me to show or say, or whether you just want us to reflect on some questions.
I think just to say, to start with, Leah, thank you very much for that. It's been fascinating. I've seen that video before and I've heard you tell us about this before, but every time it reminds me really of the unique nature of circles and why it has a role to play with certain people in a way that other models and approaches can't do. So thank you very much for setting that such a complex thing out in a very sort of straightforward way. It sounds from the questions like others have really followed it. So thank you for that. But we have got a few questions, so I wonder if between us we can answer those now. There's a couple of questions about availability in different areas, and I wonder whether if you'd like me to sort of say a little bit at the moment about our view of availability, and then if you want to mention anything from a circles perspective as well. Yeah. So are you okay for me to go first with that? So there's a couple of questions about, is it available in certain areas? I've seen changes in access and availability in my area. What might that be about? Where does funding come from? Different things about that, and what does the future look like in terms of funding? So just wanted to mention something about that really. So from a HMPPS perspective, we have a long-standing history of working with Circles UK. We provide a grant to Circles UK, so really recognising the important role that Circles UK have in setting standards to ensure really sort of high-quality delivery of circles in England and Wales. So that's been a long-standing sort of commitment, I suppose, to the model that Circles deliver against. Circles, as we've heard today from Leah, it's a long-term sort of intensive approach, and that means that it can be relatively costly in comparison to other types of interventions that we might be looking to use. Now, that's not to say that that cost doesn't really pay off in terms of preventing victims and other costs downstream. So we see that the cost benefit there, but it does cost you know, per individual. There is a cost attached to it, so we need to make sure that we are spending that money on the right people who are going to make use of that particular type of provision, and where that is linked to potential reoffending. So there's something about really making sure that we, if we're going to invest money and spend money, that we target those cases as well as we can. Leah might say a little bit more about the current provision from a Circles UK perspective. What we know from a probation perspective is that access to Circles at the moment is largely dependent on where you are geographically. So that means in some areas there's really good access to Circles. In other areas that access has changed over recent years, so it's no longer available. And we really want to get to a point where it's not a sort of postcode lottery of whether you can have access to Circles or not, based on where you are geographically. So we're working really closely with Circles at the moment to look to how we can really come together and collaborate to hopefully see a future where there will be access to Circles wherever you are in England and Wales. That is the vision. We've got some work to do around that, and getting funding for that is not always straightforward, but just wanted to really sort of set that message that we would really like to see a position in the future where it's not a case of, oh, you know, I live here, therefore I can't get it. We would like to see that that position being a much more sort of national availability. So I hope that sort of helps with where we see the future going. Leah, there were a couple of questions about specifically how do I find out if they are available in my area at the moment. So I think Jade mentioned like the Birmingham area, for example. So if you are living in an area, how do you find out if there is provision available? So I don't know if you can help with that.
Yeah, if you go onto the Circles UK website, and you click on local providers, there is a map, and it'll give you information about whether Circles are running in your area, if they're not, what we're hoping to do to achieve that there, and also how you get in touch with your local provider.
Brilliant. Okay, so thank you for that. Hopefully that gives a sort of sense of sort of the geography and those arrangements, but we've got a couple of other questions as well, Leah, that I definitely can't answer. So the first one is about, is there any scope in the future for circles to work with people who are on the autistic spectrum? So something around sort of being able to provide a specific provision for people with ASD who might be further disadvantaged because of that sort of diagnosis. So anything around that?
The answer is yes, and we have an adapted model ready and available and trialled and piloted, but it's resource dependent. Just to add, we had assumed at one point, because this is person-centred, that we could adjust every circle to best meet the needs of someone who came with, had learning difficulties or ASC spectrum conditions. We did some research and discovered that it wasn't quite fit for purpose, so we did a lot of research and adapted the approach. It's longer, the materials are different, but very often it's about gaining the resources to do that. But it's something we've always actively promoted, and we would be ready to roll out with the resources available.
Lovely, thank you, Leah. And actually following on from that, so a circles provider, if they are already in an area, could they deliver that model to somebody, or is it only certain providers who would deliver those sort of more bespoke models?
There are a range of adapted models. Some come with caveats, such as when it's with young people circles, that the coordinator must have specific background and experience in working with young people in the youth sector. With adapted circles, there are lots of materials and an operating manual that could be picked up and run with, and I think would be adaptable straight away. But a lot of our providers who do this work will also then employ a coordinator with a specialist background, and in each of those areas they provide additional input and training for volunteers doing that sort of work.
Lovely, thank you. And then there's a question from Sarah. How does a new circle start in a new area?
The process there is to identify a provider that fits the criteria and is set up and run, gets the support of MAPA, and then the money coming in to appoint a coordinator and a steering board to see that. Then that key coordinator or group of coordinators will begin the process of liaising with the professionals and reaching out to the community and recruiting those volunteers.
Brilliant. Okay, so hopefully that answers your question, Sarah. And then a question from another Sarah. Can a circle start in custody to support release?
We have tried that, and there's a lot to support it, and the transition phase. The issue we have is we require continuity of that relationship with volunteers, and very often individuals aren't released to the area where they are imprisoned. But it's something that was tried at HMP Wotton, where the circle volunteers went in 6 months prior to release and began the circle, but that was restricted to individuals then transitioning to live and resettle in Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire, so that they met them at the gate and it carried on. But the key impediment is that thing about continuity and getting in the prisons.
Yeah, so the principle is there, isn't it? The principle makes sense, and we could see why that would work in an ideal situation, but actually the realities of that somebody's journey through the prison system and release can sometimes make that more difficult.
Yes, similarly, and we've started circles in APs as well. But again, if the move on after, say, 6 months is to a completely different area, that sort of defeats the purpose, really, because the continuity is key. But if there are some guarantees that someone will be resettled in the area, we start circles in APs too.
Brilliant. OK. Thank you for that. So we've got 5 more minutes, but we have got a couple more questions, so I'm hoping we can get to them because they're really interesting questions. So one from Sandra. So I understand that this is voluntary, but what about people who deny they're offending but are willing to engage and acknowledge their isolation and want to improve that sort of social support? So that sort of that potential conflict between those who might be maintaining their innocence often for valid reasons, but are saying, despite that, I do think that I would like to be involved with this. So any thoughts about that, Leah?
And again, yes, we work with people who deny, and that's part of how we've developed the service. Initially, we didn't. Over time, there was a growing recognition that that was very necessary, and a growing understanding about the function of denial very often. And a lot of the input the volunteers do isn't around offending behaviour per se, but it will be problems associated in that individual's life that may, you know, lead to problem behaviour. And sometimes that's how it's identified. It's not ignored, but we will say to people, you have identified you have problems in your life you need to improve on, and those are the things that have meant you've got contact with the criminal justice system, but we'll flow with you. And that takes a very skilled coordinator to do that work. The assessment they do will be very detailed, but there are some examples of quite significant success.
Brilliant, thank you. And then we have a question from Kirsty, who asks about who can refer. So who can refer in, and how and who pays for the cost of the circle? Yeah, and that's the $1 million question, isn't it? Ideally, the referrals will come from the statutory agencies who understand and have assessed that individual, and we can work with them. But the funding does have to be in place. This uses volunteers, but it's still intense. And so there are costs involved. So the money has to be there from some source. It might come a bit from HMPPS. We do a lot of, you know, approaching grant agencies and charitable funders to sort of underpin and support some of the work. Approaching PCCs, etc., to see this as part of their bigger public protection approach. It's possible for core members to self-refer, and we've had that in the past, but again, there has to be the kind of funding in place for us to see that through, even though it's minimal. If we've got it there because we've acquired it from a charitable pot, then that's where we align it, but it's about resources at the end of the day. Lovely, thank you. And one final question, I think. So can people who have completed their sentence, so their community orders or licenses, become volunteers?
Oh, that's a very hot topic, and service user engagement is something we've all got on the front of our minds at the moment, have we? And we're no different. I think it's far more complex, and I think that's because if you look at any other organisation who would take on, like, you know, service users with a criminal background history, most of those then automatically exclude anybody who's got a conviction for a sexual offence, and that's something we're struggling with at the moment. And so there's a big debate within circles about how we improve service user engagement. I think volunteering was the one end of the spectrum that is along the line, but we're beginning by engaging with people who've received our service to say, how can we inform our practice? And we have things like engagement groups, reviewing policy practice, etc. But it's a sensitive area, and I think it's one that we're going to have to negotiate very carefully.
Yeah, and I think what you said there is actually that sort of lived experience voice can be used in other ways. So even if not in that sort of very front-facing role of that, it can be fed in other ways. Although I guess the other side being interesting that, you know, people with sexual convictions are part of our community, so it makes it complicated, doesn't it? Because we want volunteers who represent that person's sort of background that can be helpful, but there are real sort of challenges, and we have to prioritise risk. I guess if your ethos is no more victims, then we do still have to be really careful about how that might have an impact on a core member if you've got somebody within their circle who was a volunteer with lived experience. So I can see that is challenging.
It's also the sensitive nature of the environment we work in, and perceived risk, not actual risk necessarily, and reputational and other issues. There's a lot of press focus on this work when things shift and change, and that has to be carefully managed. It's taken us many years to move this narrative on, so we have to be very thoughtful. But as a principle, we want to improve service user engagement and have done so very powerfully, for example, in training volunteers. But every next step has to be considered because the ramifications are wide.
Right, well, thank you on that note. It's just 1 minute past 12, so I think I'm hoping that we've answered all of the questions that everyone had. And if anyone needs to, they can get in touch with us at our team. We can put the mailbox in the chat with any further questions that come up. But I just wanted to thank you, Leah, for your time today. It's been really insightful on behalf of everyone else, and to thank Emma for all of the work in seamlessly getting a video on Teams session, which is not straightforward. And thank you all for your interest in your questions. It's really helped sort of hopefully generate some interesting discussion. So it's been a pleasure, and have a good afternoon, everyone.
Yeah, goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you.